This evening, we're welcoming Dr. Mark Eakin, Director of NOAA's Coral Reef Watch program, and he'll be presenting Chasing Coral Bleaching, a Present and Ecological Disaster. Before we begin with Dr. Eakin, I'd like to go through some administrative slides for you and some information too. And for those of you who have come in and are new, please wait until the very end of our broadcast. We actually have some additional announcements at the end. Okay, so tonight's broadcast is being recorded. Links to a video archive will be sent out to you within a week. If you don't receive a link to the archive, send me an email with the subject, request link for the November 2017 webinar, because September would be completely different. Now, video archive and all the slides that are being presented tonight, both mine and Dr. Eakin's, as well as previous broadcasts going back to 2013, are available on, look at this. Actually it is. It's the NOAA Climate Stewards Google website. We have not yet been able to change the internal Google website name, so it's still called the NOAA Climate Stewards Google website, and that's the link. If you can't access it, you can send an automated access request through Google, or you can send me an email requesting access to it. All right. For those of you who are attentive and attending the entire broadcast, we'll be happy to send you this certificate of attendance, which recognizes that you have engaged NOAA Planet Stewards with 1 contact hour of professional development. And furthermore, if you want to ask a question to Dr. Eakin, please type it into the question panel on your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll be sure to narrate them to Dr. Eakin. And also, please be aware that during tonight's broadcast, you're going to receive an email with a link to a post-webinar poll. That's the link right there if you want to get ahead of us. But so when we're done with the webinar, please go to your email. You will see the an email there. Please answer it. I look at all the results. Okay, save these dates. Monday, November 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time is going to be our next NOAA Planet Stewards Book Club meeting. The book is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and it's really quite a remarkable book. Peg Steffen is going to be leading it. If you have any specific questions about it, you can send Peg an email at her email there, peg.steffen@noaa.gov. Also, Monday, December 11th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we have our next webinar, Not Just Talking Trash, Marine Debris, and What We Can Do About It. Okay. And finally, some of you may know this, but the NOAA Planet Stewards 2018 Stewardship Community applications are currently open. If you want to put your knowledge into action with your students or your community, making positive impacts on your local environment, go and apply now. If you are selected and you meet the project requirements, you will be eligible for up to $2,500 to carry out an environmental stewardship action project. And you can also, once you complete it, you can receive travel reimbursements to attend workshops or national conferences, and applications are being accepted until midnight, November 27th. You can just Google NOAA Planet Stewards. You can go to the page. You can get lots more information, and the link to apply is there as well. Okay, and with that, I am actually going to turn the mic and the screen over to Dr. Eakin, and I'd like to introduce him if I may. Dr. Mark Eakin has worked for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, for over 20 years. And as I mentioned earlier, he directs NOAA's Coral Reef Watch program, which monitors coral reef ecosystems via satellite and in-water observations. Dr. Eakin holds a PhD from the University of Miami and publishes on coral reef ecology, especially the impacts of climate change on coral reefs, coral bleaching, ocean acidification, and coral paleoclimatology. He's co-chaired the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force's Climate Change Working Group and has testified before Congress on the impacts of climate change. He's also been a contributing author on the 2014 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Assessment Report, IPCC, and a chief scientific advisor for the Sundance award-winning film Chasing Coral. And with that, Dr. Eakin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, I'm glad to be with you all again. It's been a while since I've spoken to the, it was then Climate Stewards, now Planet Stewards, and really glad to be able to be here and be a part of this program. So I'll be giving you a rundown on what's going on with coral bleaching around the world and some tools you can use for helping your students understand what's going on with corals, coral bleaching, and other environmental stressors and things we can do about stresses to coral reefs. So what we'll be doing first is talking about what is coral bleaching, and then we'll talk about the connection between warming oceans and the increase in coral bleaching. We'll talk about what happens after coral bleach, and then what does the future hold. After that, we'll have a little bit about classroom resources, and this is where I'll get to the movie Chasing Coral. So with that, we'll move on into the first section, Introduction to Coral Bleaching. And as you come in with questions, Bruce will actually be providing me with those questions in a break between each of these 5 sections. So, first question for you, though, is what is a coral? So I want everybody to tell me, is it an animal, a vegetable, or a mineral?
Okay, so this is an interactive poll, everyone, so please select on your screen what your choice is, and we will tally these in just a moment.
Do you play the Jeopardy theme during these interludes?
You feel free to hum it if you like. We're pretty flex here. But it looks pretty good. We've got about 86%, and we've got one ringer here who's chimed in, but that's okay. So I'm going to close the poll now, and I will reveal the answers. Okay, so do you see the answers on your screen, Mark?
I do. Looks like 87% animal, 5% vegetable, 8% mineral, which is pretty good. And the answer is actually, you're all right. It turns out that in the case of corals, they are animal, vegetable, and mineral. We should have put in all of the above in there. I kind of forgot that when I passed it along to you, Bruce, but it's okay. That one was pretty much for fun. But to give you an idea of the importance of the role that both animals and plants that make up this coral have in building the coral reef, which is the mineral portion. So we'll get into that. So inside of the polyps, the individual structures that make up corals, these individual polyps that sort of look like sea anemones, each one inside the tissues of the tentacles, they're microscopic algae. Those microscopic algae, or I may refer to them as zooxanthellae, are the algae that give the corals their food. They photosynthesize just like any plant does, and the combination of the plant and the animal portion of coral is able to deposit the skeleton made of calcium carbonate or limestone, and that's the structure that builds the coral and in turn builds coral reefs, the largest living structure on Earth and quite visible from space. So what happens when corals bleach? Well, coral bleaching is caused by stress, and there are a number of types of stress that can cause coral bleaching. But the main stress and what we're concerned about is happening from warm water temperatures. On the left, what it looks like when it was bleached. That is a living coral still. It's not as healthy as the one on the right that still has its algae, but it is still alive. In fact, the reason you can tell it's alive is because it is so nice and white. As soon as a coral dies, you start getting a different sort of algae, a scuzzy filamentous algae growing on the outside of the coral, and it immediately starts getting a very ugly color and texture to it. We'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. But the tissue of the coral on this one on the left is completely clear. There are no algae in the way, which are what normally provide corals with their color. And you're seeing that white limestone skeleton underneath. What you can actually see if you look on the right is there are some little ridges and edges where there are less of the zooxanthellae or the photosymbiotic algae present here. And so there are areas where, in fact, this coral may be a little bleached on the right still. So, what kind of stress will cause a coral to stress a coral and cause bleaching? Bruce, this is the next of the questions. Let's see what people think.
Okay, this is taking a little bit longer. Some folks a little bit more unsure of some of the answers. But they're coming in pretty well. Just give it a few more seconds, then we'll close out the poll. All right, just about 90% of folks voting.
High ocean temperatures, too. Yeah, very good, folks. Too much nutrients. There is a contribution of nutrients to bleaching, but nutrients on their own will not cause corals to bleach. There was somebody who said vitamin D. It's important for us to get vitamin D from sunlight, but as far as I know, it's not important for corals. Okay, so going on, the high water temperature is the biggie that we're concerned about. High light levels or high UV levels go along with the high temperatures typically. You can get something similar to bleaching at cold temperatures. Very often, though, the corals will actually just go straight from healthy to dead in a short amount of time in really low temperatures. You can get some localized things like low salinity from runoff or really heavy rain that's localized in an area, but these are fine scale. These are within individual bays. You also get some bleaching that can occur when there's an exposure to air during low tides, but if that happens for too long, much what happens, coral will die directly. So what we're going to talk about are those large-scale high water temperature events that have been causing coral bleaching around the world. So we'll get to how this works in the satellites in just a second, but generally you're looking at water temperatures that are 1 or 2 degrees Celsius or around 2 to 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit above the summer average temperatures. That causes the stress to corals that it causes bleaching to kick in. And we use satellites, NOAA satellites, as well as cooperating international partners satellites to develop the products that we use all around the world. NOAA satellites are measuring ocean temperature, and from that we're developing these products that give information on heat stress. So with that, we'll open it up if there are any questions so far. Bruce, have you seen any?
No, I think you're doing a good job. We haven't received any specific questions yet. I'd say keep going.
All right, we'll get back to questions in just a minute then. So warming ocean, more bleaching. One of the things that we've been seeing that's been one of the largest drivers of environmental change around the world has been the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That increase in carbon dioxide driven by man's activities has been measured now since the late 1950s, since something called the International Geophysical Year. And since that time, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone through its characteristic seasonal cycle every year, and it's been rising and rising. We're now at a point that we're above 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and we can expect to be there for the rest of any of our lives. That CO2 has been growing faster as well. Some years it's higher than others. You can see the growth rate on the left. We've had a really high, in fact, record high growth rate that's gone on in the left. At the same time, what the CO2 increase has done is to raise the temperatures of the oceans. It's also raising the temperature in the air, and that's mostly what you hear about in reference to global warming. But in addition to what's going on in the air, where most people pay attention, the ocean temperatures are rising, and in fact have risen quite a bit. And globally, we're looking at ocean temperatures that are about 3/4 of a degree warmer than what they were back at the early part of the last century. In fact, if you look at the most recent years, the black is 2017. That's where we are now. We've just barely still the second warmest year on record. If you look at this, you'll see 2014 was the warmest year on record. That was followed by 2015 that completely eclipsed any previous year. 2016 started out way above any and still ended up the warmest year on record. And 2017 started out as the second year. It's been running as the second warmest year on record, and probably is going to end up somewhere in here around the third warmest year on record. But we'll see. We still have a few months of data yet to come in. The data typically come in about the middle of the month for the previous month, so we're still waiting on the information on October. NOAA has satellites, as well as a number of partner agencies in other countries have satellites that measure a variety of environmental parameters around the world. Most of this is used for weather, and you're used to seeing these data coming in and being used for weather forecasts. But there are two classes of satellites. One are polar orbiting satellites. These go from pole to pole as the Earth rotates underneath, and so they cover the entire area of the Earth. In fact, the polar orbiters that we're using go over any spot twice a day. Then we also have the geostationary weather satellites. These are the ones that are usually providing you with the pictures of where the hurricanes are, for example. These sit in one spot over the equator at all times and give you a lot of pictures throughout the day of that portion of the globe. It takes 5 of those around the world to cover the entire planet with geostationary data. And so we're using a combination of all of those, and we're using them to measure ocean temperatures. So let's go for another poll here. What do you think is the temperature that the ocean has to reach when corals start to bleach? Bruce? So you have your options before you.
Okay. A lot of thinking going on here.
I'm not surprised. This one takes a minute. This is something that most people won't have in the back of their heads.
Well, while folks are trying to figure this out, there was a question from one of your earlier graphs, which we could get back to if you want, which was, why did the ocean appear to heat up in one of your graphs during the 1940s?
There are normal natural cycles, oscillations of temperature that occur, and in fact, some of these that are driving a large part of the climate are based on changes that occur primarily in the Pacific Ocean, or at least driven by the They last for several decades. Something that used to be known as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and is now most commonly known as the Interdecadal Pacific Variability, leads to several decades of, about 3 decades of warmer than normal temperatures, followed by a few decades of cooler than normal temperatures, and that's a normal oscillation. But the problem is that oscillation is now being superimposed on a rising baseline temperature, and so it's become more like a stair step. So in fact, the temperatures were higher in that period back in the 40s. They cooled back down, and they should have stayed cooler until the next warming, but instead they started warming, and then they warmed even faster. The problem is right now we're back in one of those extreme warming periods, and that's why the temperatures are going up so much so fast.
Thank you, Mark. All right, so close the poll now, and here are the results.
All between 80 degrees Fahrenheit and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 27 and 29 degrees. So keeping that in mind, 27 and 29 degrees C, let's take a look at the graph, and what do we see? For the most part, from about 27 to 31 degrees, that's when you have the majority of your bleaching. So people were pretty close to dead on there. 27's about at the low end of it, and 29 is right in the center. 31, you're pretty much in the middle of where bleaching occurs. By the time you get to 33 degrees, most corals around the world are seeing temperatures that are either way above what they normally see, or you're looking at some of the places around the world where the temperatures are always quite warm, like the Arabian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, excuse me. The Arabian Sea is a very warm area, and so its temperatures, baseline temperatures are much higher, and so bleaching happens even up to around 33 degrees and above. So the temperature at which corals bleach really is dependent on the normal temperatures at that location and how much stress it takes above. And it normally takes about 1 degree Celsius, or about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit above the average temperature of the warmest summer month at that location for corals to bleach. And in fact, that relationship is borne out quite well when we go through and look at different areas around the world. When we look at our products of heat stress, which you're seeing on the the lower panels there, and when you look at the bleaching, which is in the upper panels, you're looking at what happened in 1998, in 2002, and more recently in 2016. That is the Great Barrier Reef of Australia you're seeing, and you can see up here during the 2016 event that's just been going on. Whoops, my apologies. 2016 event, we have the warmest, the highest bleaching up in this northern section, and that's right where the warmest temperatures or the warmest temperature anomalies were being felt. So there was a lot of heat stress going on up there. If you look in contrast to the 1998 event, which really the bleaching was not nearly as severe, but was mostly in the southern Great Barrier Reef, you see that's where the warmest temperatures were as well. So this is from a paper that we had come out and was on the cover of Nature on 16th of March this year, talking about this 2016 Great Barrier Reef bleaching event. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So what you're going to be seeing are some graphics which are a combination of two of our products, our hotspot product and our degree heating week. And that is what you see in the yellow all over here. Anytime the hotspots are present, anytime they're above the temperature of the warmest summer month at that location, you know that your temperatures are warm enough that coral bleaching becomes a possibility. Now, the other product we use, the degree heating week product, is an accumulated heat stress over a period of 12 weeks. And by looking at that accumulation of heat stress, so how warm it is and for how long, we can do a good job of predicting where corals bleach. So all of the areas, ooh, I'm not sure why that happened. Let me back up. Okay, anytime you see this orange, that's when you're in a bleaching warning. That means we've accumulated enough heat stress that corals may start bleaching soon. The red colors Alert level 1 is when corals are likely to bleach in those locations, and the darker red is alert level 2, and that's when there's likelihood that you're going to start seeing corals dying in those locations. So let's walk through the recent global coral bleaching event. The third global coral bleaching started in 2014. This event started in the Western Pacific, in Guam and the Marianas. And remember, Guam, which is actually a part of the US, it's one of our territories in the Western Pacific, because we'll talk about the bleaching in Guam more in just a few minutes. The bleaching started in Guam and the Marianas in 2014. Then it picked up in Hawaii, especially up in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands in the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. Started seeing some bleaching in South Florida, and then later on in the year, as the sun was more over the equator, we started getting bleaching in the Marshall Islands. As we moved to 2015, we saw even more bleaching, and here the event went global. We saw bleaching first in South Pacific, Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Fiji, American Samoa, and Independent Samoa, in the Chagos or British Indian Ocean Territory, the Maldives, in the southern Red Sea. Then the El Nino kicked in. We started seeing bleaching in Kiribati, in Panama, and then later in the year back in Hawaii again, this time in the main Hawaiian Islands, and all throughout the Caribbean. And if it wasn't bad enough that we've now had the second global bleaching event on record, it continued and got worse in 2016. In 2016, there was even more intense heat stress in many areas. Great Barrier Reef had its worst bleaching on record. The bleaching across the Indian Ocean was quite severe. We again had bleaching in parts of the Western Pacific. Kiribati actually had heat stress, and some of those corals were exposed to high heat for an entire year. And in fact, there was an island down in that area that had 98% coral mortality. We also had bleaching that went on in the Caribbean. And finally, as we move forward into 2017, the event continues a little bit longer, back into the Great Barrier Reef again, a bit in American Samoa and the little island of Niue. We thought the bleaching was going to continue in that global pattern, but as it started in the Indian Ocean, it bleached in the southwestern part of Madagascar, and the rest of the Indian Ocean didn't kick in. And so this was quite good. We did not have the continuation of this as a global event. Now, we have had bleaching in 2017 again in Guam. It's starting in Micronesia. We've seen a little bit of bleaching stress in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and of heat stress and reports of bleaching throughout the southern to southeastern Caribbean. What's gone on in 2014 to 2017 has in fact been the longest global bleaching event ever, lasting a full 3 years. It's only been a 1-year event in 1998 and in 2010, so this 3-year event was especially bad. It was the most widespread bleaching event, and in fact, over 75% of reefs around the world bleached. You add up the area of all of those reefs, and it's greater than the size of Washington State. If you add up the area where you had corals exposed to the heat stress that causes them to die, that's bigger than the state of West Virginia. And because this was a long-term event, more than half of reef areas were exposed twice. Guam's been exposed 4 out of the last 5 years, and all reef areas around the world receive some degree of heat stress. Along with that, we have seen that a large percentage of areas around the world were suffering from heat stress. The black diamonds here are showing you what happens when you get the amount of area that has heat stress at alert levels 1 and 2. You can see that the combination of this 3-year event was much higher than the previous record in 98. Even 2016 alone noses out 1998. And the same thing if you look down here in the red, which is just alert level 2, that highest level of stress. 2016 is a bit higher than 1998, and the combination of the 3 years is much higher. So this was a tremendous damaging event, and we're still collecting from information from people around the world on just how much damage it caused. When you look at these reefs, this is that scuzzy algae I was talking about. When the coral dies, it gets covered with this and looks like a barren wasteland. In fact, this image from the Great Barrier Reef's bleaching in 2016 by Justin Marshall at the University of Queensland, the lack of fish was an indication that there was complete ecosystem collapse. In fact, in 2016, the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef, many areas had over 50% mortality. Most had over 85 to 90% bleaching. And if you look at the Great Barrier Reef as a whole, 29% of the live coral on the Great Barrier Reef died in 2016. This has been the most extensive event. It has ended. It ended as a global event in in May of 2017. But bleaching problems still continue. As I mentioned a minute ago, Guam has seen 4 of the last 5 years. We're starting to see bleaching in Micronesia, and we're concerned it's going to go back into the Marshall Islands again. And as I mentioned, southwestern to southeastern Caribbean has been experiencing heat stress, and that is still growing right now. So with that, we'll go back to any questions that you have.
And oh boy, we have some excellent questions, Mark.
Good.
All right. So, one question, well, we have one question about ocean acidification, but we'll leave that till a little bit later.
Good.
One of the questions that we have is, when did scientists start recording coral bleaching events?
The first recorded widespread coral bleaching event was in 1983. It was a part of the 1982-83 El Nino. And if you notice a pattern here, this first major bleaching was in 1983 associated with that El Nino. The 1998 first global bleaching was another major one. Those two are considered the two biggest on record. 2010 was a moderate scale El Nino. It wasn't that strong. And 2015, 2016, there was another El Nino that looked like it was going to be really large, but probably is only about the 5th largest on record. But because of the amount of background warming that's been happening, that warming was enough to push the reefs over the top and cause this 3-year event. So it really is a new thing. Localized bleaching in individual bays was known previously, but any sort of large-scale bleaching like this is really known only since the early 1980s.
Okay, I'm going to give you 2 back-to-back questions, and then we can go back to your presentation. The first one, based on the amount of coral bleaching that you've seen continuously, have scientists placed a potential or possible estimated timeline for life left on the Great Barrier Reef? That's sort of part 1. And the second one is it possible for coral bleaching to bring forth new life similar to what forest fires do in those kinds of ecosystems?
Yes. Well, I'll hit the second one first, because the problem is if coral bleaching keeps happening over and over, it's like having forest fires coming through in areas where a forest fire has already come through. So it really is a problem. You do have new life that can spring forth afterwards. We'll get to that in the recovery section in just a minute. The concern we have is that as temperatures continue to rise, that we're going to be losing a lot of coral reefs. I don't recall exactly when the date expected is for the Great Barrier Reef, but because of the rising temperatures, either from climate models or even just watching the trajectory of temperatures from observations, you find that sometime around 2050, 90% of the coral reefs around the world are going to be suffering from the kind of heat stress that causes bleaching on an annual basis, and that's just not sustainable. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, and in fact we'll talk about that second question in this section on after corals bleach. So can corals recover? Yes, and that is the good news. If the heat stress doesn't last too long and isn't too severe, then corals can survive. Some corals are better able to survive by eating more plankton. They're less dependent on the zooxanthellae for their food source. Other corals are more resistant to bleaching. They actually have an ability to withstand higher temperatures. And so they also don't bleach as much or as hard. And some corals are able to fast. Important things that we're learning through these bleaching events are which are the ones that are more resistant, which are the ones that can respond more quickly. So looking at this, the zooxanthellae can grow back. Most of what happens is it's reproduction of the algae remaining in the corals. And what grows back tend to be algae that are most able to resist high temperatures because less of them are actually ejected by the corals during the bleaching event. And so these more resistant algae tend to be the ones who bounce back first, but they tend to be less productive. So over time, the coral will shift from those more resistant ones back to the most productive ones, leaving them at risk when the next worm event happens. But you can have conditions where bleaching occurs, but it's not too severe, and you start seeing the recovery of color in corals, usually a few weeks to a couple of months after the ocean cools. However, may not. In fact, if you look at this, you'll see while some of this area is growing back nicely, you also have algae growing over some dead areas on those colonies. So it's something that can, part of the coral may recover, or some corals may recover and others may not. So what happens if they don't? If the stress is too severe, corals will die on their own immediately. If it's too long lasting, the corals will be weakened because they've lost, in losing the zooxanthellae, they've lost their primary source of food. They're also injuring themselves as they do this, so there's damage to the cells when they eject the algae. So some polyps may die, portions of colonies may die, entire colonies may die. If corals die, then the reef can grow back, and this goes back to that forest fire analogy. But what tends to happen is you start getting regrowth of the fast-growing corals in a decade or two, but the slow-growing corals that take 100 years or more to grow back. And so that can be a very slow process. So what else can heat stress do to corals? So it's back time for me to ask you a question. What can happen to corals? It's similar to what happens with people. What happens to people when they are highly stressed?
Okay, the polls are open.
So do people who are stressed gain weight? Do they get sick? Or do they turn orange?
I guess it depends if they're stress eaters or not.
Well, that is true. Well, we'll see how many people answer that way.
Okay, we've got just about everyone who's coming in. Just another second. Make your final choices, final selections. All right.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Well, no one put gain weight. Oh, interesting spelling there, Bruce.
No, sorry.
There are stress eaters, and yes, gain weight actually is something that can happen. I see some people had fun with turning orange. I've heard of jaundice turning yellow, and I've certainly heard of turning blue, but I've never heard of turning orange unless you eat way too many carrots. Most of the people, the problem you run into is they get sick, and that happens to corals as well. So when corals are stressed, not only do they bleach, but they will tend to get sick. They're more susceptible to disease. And in fact, here's an image, and you'll see two things going on simultaneously. This was during the 2005 bleaching event in the Caribbean. This coral, through time, you can see getting paler and paler as the bleaching occurs. This over the course of just a few weeks from August 11th to September the 6th. Disease, in this case a spreading disease called black band disease, is spreading across that colony. The high temperatures can stress the coral, can also make the pathogens grow faster. And so you see a combination here of both bleaching and disease. Bleaching can kill parts of colonies, diseases, depending on the type of disease, can kill parts of colonies or can kill entire colonies of coral. So, do we have any other questions at this point?
Oh gosh, yes, lots more have been coming in.
Okay, let's hit a few key ones that are appropriate to this section.
Right, so why don't we ask this, is there a tipping point of percent bleaching at which a coral reef cannot recover?
So even if a coral reef is completely bleached, if all of the corals on the reef bleached, if it's a short-term event, there's a chance that those corals could all recover. Now that's bleaching. Now let's go to mortality. If all the corals on a reef die, there is the possibility that new corals can recruit in from elsewhere. Through sexual reproduction, the larvae will actually be carried in the water and can come in and start to see recovery on that reef. We have seen severe reef bleaching and mortality that has eventually led to recovery of the corals. But if you have too many corals dying, you're not going to have very many sources of new larvae, especially if the reef is a long way from neighboring reefs. So there's no precise tipping point, but there certainly are things that can lead in that direction.
Okay, one other question that we've had in that I thought was quite interesting, it sort of relates back to that sort of forest fire question, was, is it possible if many corals die on the reef after a bleaching event, has it been observed that other corals that might be particularly resistant or more resistant, that they have spread out and taken over large parts of a reef where possibly they hadn't before?
Yes, in fact, the ones that that survive potentially can start expanding and taking space. The problem is most of the corals that survive bleaching events, and especially severe ones with a lot of mortality, tend to be slow-growing corals. And so those slow-growing corals are tougher, they're more resistant, and more able to bounce back after the event. But because they're slow-growing, they're not one that can really compete for space. And it's your fast-growing, more weedy species that are the ones that can grow back quickly. They're also some of the ones that are most affected by bleaching events.
Okay. And is, there's one question here that might require a bit of explanation on your part, but I think it's an interesting question, which is how will corals in the mesophotic zone be affected and or offer possible resiliency to bleaching events?
Oh, great question. So I'll explain mesophotic. Mesophotic are those areas that are in deeper water where there's less light, but it's still in the part of a deep reef where you get light coming down from the surface. This is important because there are also deep sea corals, which are down in areas where there's no light. They don't photosynthesize, so you don't have the problem of bleaching. They have no interested. In the mesophotic zone, you have less light. A lot of corals in the mesophotic zone are different from the ones you have in shallow, so they're different species. But some are the same species as you have up shallow. The question is, oh, well, since they're deeper, maybe they won't get as warm. Well, the problem is these really big bleaching events have been pushing high temperatures. The warming has been pushing high temperatures down into deeper and deeper water. And those corals in the greater depths, the mesophotic corals, are not used to much variation in temperature at all. So they actually have a tendency to bleach quite a bit. The other thing is, even though they may be the same species, in a lot of studies that have been going on, studies of genetics show that the deep water corals, or the mesophotic corals of two different islands, are more closely related than the same species in mesophotic reefs are to shallow water corals of the same species on the same island. So in other words, from deeper to shallow on the reef, there's less genetic similarity, so less connection between the populations than there is between mesophotic reefs on two different islands. So very interesting things going on that we just don't know. There's some possibilities they can help out. So far, it doesn't look like they're going to be able to really provide any sort of great salvation for reefs.
Pretty
All right, well, let's go on, and we'll come back to more questions in a minute. All right, so what does the future hold? Let's think about what's happening as the climate continues to warm. So we're dealing with a worldwide crisis. This picture again from what's happened. We're at a widespread problem, and one that's been affecting reefs all around the world, some areas worse than others. This heat stress is adding to other stresses that are out there, things like overfishing or damaging fishing practices, pollution such as nutrients or fertilizer runoff like sediments or other pollutants, all of which are stressing corals and acting in combination with high temperatures. We had already lost from those other stressors over half of the world's coral reefs prior to this 2014 to 2017 bleaching event. Some of it from bleaching, a lot of it from disease, a lot of it from other problems that have been going on around the world. If we look at climate models, this comes from a study that was in a document called Reefs at Risk Revisited. It's actually working off of some of the older modeling studies, but the models using the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessments and the most sophisticated models to date show very similar patterns. These are looking at the probability or the frequency, the percentage of years of alert level 2 events around the world. So these are the events that cause corals not only to bleach but to die. And we're looking in the 2050s for most coral reefs around the world to be exposed over 90% of the time to temperatures that cause coral bleaching. And that is absolutely not sustainable. Coral reefs cannot tolerate that much bleaching over and over. This is like the question about the wildfires. This is like having a fire come through again every single year. There are two things we need to be doing to deal with this. The first one is we need to be lowering global carbon dioxide levels. To reduce emissions. That's important, but that's only the first step. We actually have to reduce CO2 around the world. We're currently right around 410 parts per million, and we need to get probably below 350 parts per million, which is the level we were at back in the 1970s. There's some questions that it actually is lower and needs to be more like 325, but either way, we need to be going down. And at this point, we're still continuing to go up. But the other thing is at the same time as we're dealing with climate change, because if we deal with climate change to the best of our ability, it's going to be a very slow ship to turn around. There are things we can do to increase the resistance or resilience of reefs. There's some innovative ideas that have come out for shading of reefs, and you see a picture of one of these experiments down here, or even cooling of reefs. And those are new ideas, and we'll see how well they might work. There are experiments that are going on to try these, but even so, they can only be done in localized areas. More importantly, what we should be doing is protecting reefs from some of the things that we should already have been protecting them from. Improving water quality by reducing pollutants, reducing other stresses, including things like disease, and reducing overfishing of reefs, especially avoiding the overfishing of things like this parrotfish down here, your lawnmowers of the reef that are very important in mowing down those algae that grow up on reefs after corals are bleached and die. if for those reefs around the world where we've seen recovery and seen the corals bouncing back, it's always been in places where they had a nice, healthy population of herbivorous fish, those lawnmowers of the reef, as well as things like sea urchins and such that could keep the reef clean. And it's very important. Coral reefs are just a nice place to visit. They're worth over $9.8 trillion per year in terms of fish, in terms of seafood, in terms of tourism, and in terms of coastal protection. The coastal protection alone is huge, protecting shorelines because coral reefs act as breakwaters and prevent the big waves from reaching shore as readily as they otherwise would. Somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion people are dependent on reefs for their food, their livelihood, and their shoreline protection. Coral reefs also have the highest biodiversity of any ecosystems around the world, and in fact are more diverse than rainforests. People refer to the the coral reefs as the rainforests of the sea. We really ought to be calling the rainforest the coral reefs of the land. So whether you want a really healthy, vibrant coral reef with lots of structure and fish, whether you want something that's sort of still around but capable of surviving, or if you're willing to take the rubble that's left over after these events, the future really is up to us. So what can you do, and what can your students and the people you're talking to in outreach groups, what can they do? First of all, don't do things that directly cause the damage to coral reefs. And one of those is buying jewelry or souvenir made from corals or other reef animals. Very important to reduce your own personal carbon footprint, as well as call on others, governments and countries to do their part. Be a responsible tourist. And one of the things that's very valuable is knowing the area that you're going to. What kind of fish are safe to eat without being to overshoot? You should learn more about coral reefs. And this is very important, to learn what goes on coral reefs, what the threats are, so you can talk to other people and spread the word. And in fact, the movie Chasing Coral is a great way to spread the word. We'll come back to that in just a second when we get to our classroom resources. We'll get to a few more questions before that. Bruce, what have we got?
Well, again, we've got lots of questions. You know, I want to get back to one of our earlier questions, which is, when did scientists first start recording coral bleaching events?
Oh, we answered that one, and that was 1983 was the first widespread bleaching event.
Oh, okay. It might have gotten garbled through, so I didn't. Thank you. I appreciate that. And you know, and historically, when you have measured other sort of coral bleaching events, what percentage of those bleached corals typically died?
It really depends on the location and the severity of the event. That's not an easy one to say. A reef that has more than 50% bleaching, you're going to see some mortality going on. When you get up to as much as 75% of the reef bleaching, you're going to see a lot of mortality. When you start looking at 90 to 100% of the reef bleaching, then you're likely to see maybe 3/4 or more of the corals dying. As I said, in a small island called Jarvis Island, which is a U.S. island, but it's in the area of the country of Kiribati in the Central Pacific. During that big El Nino event during 2015 and 2016, all of the corals bleached, and 98% of the corals died.
Wow. So with, you know, one of the things that it's pretty clear on your map is that a lot of the coral bleaching events, or majority of them, occur in the equatorial region, that band where we typically see corals. Have there been thoughts, or have there been models that as sort of those equatorial areas begin to experience much higher heat temperatures, that there may be possible migration of corals to more northern or southern latitudes away from the equator?
This has happened. In fact, as conditions are warming, we've seen some of the fast-growing, easily spread corals, some of the branching corals, have been moving into more poleward reef locations. And there has been some movement of that. There's been studies of some corals moving up through the Japanese archipelago, moving down the west coast of Australia, some expansion of reefs going up the east coast of Florida, although it's a little uncertain whether that was an improvement in water quality, warming, or some combination of the two. The problem, though, is, remember, corals are animal, vegetable, and mineral. And just as your growing zones change throughout the world, so do the growing zones for corals. And one of the things that's important, and many of you who are gardeners have experienced this, you may have warm enough temperatures, but if you don't have enough light, if you don't have a long enough growing period and enough sunlight, some crops, some vegetables, for example, just won't grow well or won't produce. And the same thing applies to corals. So as they move more poleward, they're getting less light. And so those corals then start to move up and grow closer to the surface. And when they grow close to the surface, they suffer more of temperature, both more high temperature events and more cold events, because as you move poleward, you get more cold fronts. So it's not an easy answer to have corals just go moving poleward.
Well, we actually had a couple of questions that focus on ocean acidification, Mark, and I'm wondering if you might be able to speak briefly to ocean acidification and impact on coral bleaching, and whether or not there's any kind of synergy between the two, higher temperatures and ocean acidification.
There is, and in fact this is important because increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is causing both of these problems. There is some synergy. There have been some studies that have shown that in some species of corals, higher bleaching occurs more at the same temperature in acidified water than in unacidified water. In other words, ocean acidification is making corals more sensitive to high temperatures. And so some corals do exhibit that, others don't. And so it's a fairly complex relationship that does not have a simple answer. The other thing that's very important is after a reef bleaches and you have a lot of mortality, the corals have to grow back. As ocean acidification increases, it slows the rate at which corals can grow. So the corals cannot bounce back as fast. So your recovery of reefs is a lot slower. So this is one of the biggest things that comes in. Really, I used to be much more concerned about ocean acidification affecting coral reefs than I am now. And what's changed is not that I'm less concerned about ocean acidification. It's after already reaching this point of having this 3 bleach and this has caused, I'm just much more worried about the temperatures and think the ocean acidification is going to be a much less of an issue to deal with. Good question. I mean, the ocean acidification is an issue that we do need to discuss. Well, let's go through the classroom resources, and then we'll come back to some more of these questions at the end. So among these resources, there are a lot of things that are available. I'll talk about some things we have actually within Coral Reef Watch's website, which is at coralreefwatch.noaa.gov, and things that you'll see on that and can use in the classroom directly. Of course, all of our products are there, but one of the things that makes it easy to work with and fun in a classroom is to use something like Google Earth. We also have tools in Google Maps, but the spinning globe and the ability to go around and pop up the individual locations on that globe can be quite a good experience. And it even teaches tropical geography to people who it's not an area that they're used to dealing with and finding on maps. So I mean, you know, think about it yourselves. You could probably all know where Papua New Guinea is there, but did you know where the nation of Kiribati was located? Much less the island of Nui. So yeah, it's a good way to get some geography tossed in along the lines while you're going in and learning about where coral bleaching is going on right now. So we have past history products or what's going on right now, and you can go in and see up to the minute bleaching information in terms of the heat stress around the world. And it provides links to the data where you can go in and use the data resources. You know, some of those include time series plots of what's going on at any particular location around the world, how much heat stress there is, and how severe the bleaching might be. We also have a remote sensing curriculum on our website that goes through and talks about our various products, but most teases remote sensing, what remote sensing is, about the electromagnetic spectrum, satellites, some things like plankton and ocean color, and then gets into coral reefs and coral bleaching. All of these were developed in response to some earlier science standards. They're not, it has not been updated to the latest standards that came out recently. Would love to have a teacher work with us to go through and adapt this to hit on the latest standards in curriculum that are out now. But in addition, there's a wide variety of other things that are available from NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program and other parts of NOAA. There's the data in the classroom activities where you can go through and look at information about coral bleaching, and there are some study problems that you can work through and talk through what's going on coral reefs. There are coral reef activity booklets. There are even, for the multilingual, some of these are going to be coming out soon in English, but all about coral reefs, mangroves, and marine herbivores. That's a sea urchin in the one on the right. Currently available in Spanish and soon in English as well. There's a series of wonderful videos being put together by the Ocean Today group, and they have these Ocean Today videos every full moon. So on each full moon, once a month, they come out with a new video talking about various environmental issues and things related to the oceans. There are also animations of coral bleaching and what's going on the web. This particular one is a really amusing way to teach coral bleaching even to adults. It's just a lot more fun than going through the normal process of describing bleaching and what goes on. And the coral program has these new climate change and reef resilience activities that have recently been put together. You can also get involved in local reef science activities. There's a widespread, a global activity called Reef Check, which is for doing actual surveys and getting percent coral cover and things like that. Some simpler things, though, are just being a part of these activities that allow people to be the eyes on the reef or the eyes of the reef. Going in, looking at coral reefs to see how much bleaching is going on, if there are diseases, and reporting that to people so that experts can go out and follow up on those observations. The Eyes of the Reef Hawaii program is a big one. In the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, we have the coral bleaching program there. There's also a Southeast Florida coral bleaching program. Both of these are known as Bleach Watch. And there's also a Bleach Watch program in the Virgin Islands. They've even put together an app for it. So you can just use your phone for reporting bleaching events. So these are great ways that you can get trained and go out when you're snorkeling or diving. If you happen to have happen to be lucky enough to be near a reef, or if you have trips that you take out to the reef, you can get involved in these programs. So finally, I told you before we'd talk about Chasing Coral. If you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to see it. It is streaming on Netflix. It was, we won the Audience Award for Best U.S. Documentary at the Sundance Film Festival, where it premiered this year. It's been nominated for Critics' Choice Awards. It is a contender for the Oscars. fingers crossed on that. We're waiting for nomination season. You can find out more about at the Chasing Coral website, and you can go on Chasing Coral, in fact, to organize a screening locally in your area. This is a very important thing you can do, is to hold your own screenings. You can also use Chasing Coral as something in the classroom, and they're soon going to be coming out with a special curriculum with things you can do to teach what's going on coral reefs, with film clips that will be available that you can download and show in the classroom. And there'll be a lot more of these curriculum and film clips coming out in the very near future. And a lot of this is something that we're going to detail at a workshop at the National Science Teachers Association that Bruce and I will be involved in. So if you're coming to the National Science Teachers Association meeting in Atlanta, sign up for the coral bleaching activities. In fact, we're going to have 3 back-to-back workshops, one on ice, one on coral, and one on further classroom activities. So in summary, corals are animal, vegetable, and mineral, and this is very important in what goes on in corals and coral reefs and why coral bleaching is such a problem. We are seeing the increase in the hot water that causes coral bleaching around the world. Fortunately, we can pinpoint areas at risk using satellites and warn managers in advance of bleaching. Bleaching is getting worse as the oceans warm, and we need to be acting to save coral reefs. And this involves both reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and in reducing local threats. And most importantly is spreading the word about what coral reefs are, why they're so important, and the threats that they're facing. So with that, we've reached the end. Bruce, back to questions.
Okay. Yes, we do have some questions. We'll have just a couple of minutes of questions. Then I would like to finalize with a couple of slides and announcements. We can end the recording, but then if there are additional questions, we will continue to take those. So one question that I have for you, Mark, is can you discuss a little bit what happens to the organismal, the ecosystems that surround a coral reef when it dies? Is there a changeover in species that populate a reef that, no longer has coral as its, main substrate, that now it's getting populated by algae? Do new animals come out? Is it completely abandoned? What happens to it?
Yeah, absolutely. There are changes. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of new animals coming out, new animals coming in. There is an increase in the population of your herbivores if you have a healthy population. If it's overfished, that unfortunately won't happen. But if you do have a healthy population of herbivores, they will start to explode and mow down the algae, and that's when you start having the ability to see some recovery of that ecosystem. But in the meantime, when the corals have died, there are a lot of organisms that require corals and coral reefs, require living coral to live, and those organisms are going to die. They don't have the coral, they can't move away, they don't know where the next reef is, and they probably can't get there anyway. There are others that are living on reefs but not completely dependent on them. Some of the fish especially will start to move to other habitats, will move away. Some of them won't be able to compete in those new habitats. They may not be able to find enough food and die. They also will have their and they're more susceptible to predation. So we see a lot of fish loss. We see a lot of loss of many of the invertebrates that live on coral reefs. There's a dramatic drop in biodiversity that occurs after a bleaching event that leads to major mortality.
And are we seeing possibility of extinction level events for certain species that may be associated with certain reefs?
Yes, we are. And in fact, for corals themselves, there was a proposal to list 82 species of corals under the Endangered Species Act. The number actually that were listed was much lower. It was about 20 new corals were listed. There are some corals that are really at risk at this point. And there is one species of coral in the Eastern Pacific that, to the best we can tell, has already been driven extinct because of high temperatures and coral bleaching.
Wow. So we've heard in the news, at least I've read in the news in a number of different articles about efforts to reseed reefs that have been damaged by coral bleaching with more heat-tolerant species. If that's done to a reef, and if a reef does then become repopulated with a more heat-tolerant species over time, do you see a subsequent shift in the organismal, the animal ecosystem, the other, like the fish or any other organisms that now populate that reef?
Yeah, they start coming back as soon as you have healthy corals again. So what you're describing, Bruce, is actually one of the biggest success stories in coral reef conservation, and one of the reasons why I'm still hopeful for coral reefs in the future. There are some reefs that are going to survive as we and we need to focus a lot of effort in those areas, and there's an effort called 50 Reefs. You can look at it in 50reefs.org to find out more about it. And this effort is looking to identify those reefs most likely to survive into the future, and at the same time be the ones that are capable of reseeding surrounding reefs once we get climate change under control. At the same time, there have been major conservation efforts to propagate corals in nurseries and to grow corals in nurseries. And they're finding great ways to be able to grow these up quickly and put them back out to reseed them on reefs. But the problem is the temperature is continuing to rise. And you've hit on the last of these. There's some major efforts that are going on, especially one involving Ruth Gates at the University of Hawaii and her research partner in Australia, Madeline Van Oppen at the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and they're working on breeding supercorals. This isn't genetic engineering, this is good old-fashioned crossbreeding, figuring out which corals survive best, crossing them with others, and then in the laboratory exposing them to tough conditions so that they are able to turn on the genes and physiological mechanisms to protect them, and then taking those corals and planting those back out on the reef. And these are major efforts that need to be done in these places where we're most likely to see coral survival. So there's a lot that's being done right now to try and help, but just remember the scale of this. This is a big area, and a lot has to be done to figure out how to scale this up to be able to appropriately apply these techniques across coral reefs.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm actually going to cut away from Mark right now and just show a few more of my slides just so we can then end the recording. But if you still have questions that you'd like to ask, we will come back to Dr. Eakin after I sort of go through these. One of the things that Mark mentioned was the Ocean Today Every Full Moon series of videos. This is actually the page from this month, and this is actually an 8-part series this month which focuses on coral reef, coral bleaching, some of the benefits that we get from corals, as well as can corals recover. And this month is called Coral Comeback. Can corals survive from these bleaching events? And these are really useful short-form videos for use in classrooms or in informal educational settings. They run probably anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes in length. I really urge you to check them out, to go and sign up to get notified whenever these come out. They are just really terrific. Also, for those people who joined in late, I just want to let everyone know to go and check your email. I've sent you an email. If you've registered, you've gotten a link to our post-webinar poll. Please go and complete it now. I'm also just going to do a follow-up and say, save the date, Monday, November 27th at 8 p.m. for our next book club meeting, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. And Peg Steffen is going to be leading that. Peg, would you like to say anything about this book that you're going to be leading the book club on?
Why, sure. I've been reading this book and very interested to learn a lot about some of the indigenous uses of many plants, and there's a lot of really great philosophy and viewpoints about sustainability. So if you're interested, I think you would be a really great book, and I'll be sending out the questions to everyone later on this week.
Thanks, Peg. And for those of you who have been interested in the book club but who have not necessarily made it, I'd like to let everybody know that on the new and Planet Stewards website, we have an entire book club section which goes back to quite a few of the books and some of the guiding questions, if you'd like to go back and check that out. So that's also a great opportunity. And again, if you joined us late, please save the date, Monday, December 11th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We've got our next webinar, Not Just Talking Trash, Marine Debris and What We Can Do About It. And finally, another announcement for everyone who joined us late, that the NOAA Planet Stewards 2018 Stewardship Community application season is open. You can go to the NOAA Planet Stewards website. You can get more information on what it means to be part of the stewardship community and what's involved in participating and joining. And there are some really excellent benefits for you to join this ongoing community of learning, with financial benefits to carry out a stewardship project, travel reimbursements to attend workshops or national conferences. And we've actually had some pretty special professional development opportunities that we've been able to afford to folks that have actually completed stewardship projects, like going to view a launch of a NOAA weather satellite. So things of this nature. It's open now, and it's open until midnight, November 27th. All the information is there. So while we do that, I'm going to go back and see if we have any other questions for Mark over here, if you've had any additional questions. Let's take a look. Mark, you still with us?
I am.
Okay. Actually, you know what I will do? I will leave this up, and I'm going to stop our recording, but we'll continue to take our questions. So thanks very much for those of you who have joined us, and